Hello, everyone. My name is Hikaru Suzuki, and I am from Lancaster University. Today, I'd like to talk about my research on partisan media coverage, U.S. Capitol riot in 2021, which I used a cognitive linguistic approach to critical discourse analysis. I'd like to start my presentation with a brief summary of background. Um, After that, I report my findings on metaphor and grammatical constructions and the press coverage later in this presentation. So, first of all, U.S. Capitol riot was a pro-status quo social movement, which means a conservative political protest organized by supporters of Donald Trump. Protesters were motivated to disrupt a congressional joint session, which was to formalize Joe Biden's victory, believing that the election was fraud. Um, they ended up committing various crimes in and outside of the Capitol building, and the protest yielded a number of arrests. The research addresses how such right-wing protest was depicted in partisan media like Fox News and NBC. So let's move on to media discourse of social movements. So when we talk about media coverage of political protests, it's imperial to consider protest paradigm, which is a journalistic practice that routinely treats political protests in a pejorative manner. In this context, political protests are often disparaged by media by sensationalism centered coverage. Um, Press coverage anchored with sensationalism is not great for protesters because their motivations and political agenda are masked and not so well addressed. And such phenomenon is mainly documented in the field of media studies, but a small number of studies in linguistics that have been illuminating linguistic aspects of such journalistic practice. So one of the early studies are done by Van Dyke, um, who studied press coverage of civil unrest in 1985, occurred in three British cities. He found discursive constructions in the newspapers uh, were built around argumentation schemas, lexical styles, and overall editorial organization steering blame assignments to a certain population in England. Fang similarly did a discourse analysis on how international political protests are depicted in Chinese newspaper, People's Daily. She found that grammatical constructions such as transitivity indexes ideological slant of a newspaper as well. And recent cognitive turn in the discourse analysis shed lights on cognitive effects of such linguistic features that steers our way of thinking about political protests. For instance, Friedrichsson investigated climate change protests in Germany and found that metaphor actually is an important ideological site that disparaged the protest. On the other hand, Hart uses a cognitive approach to grammar and found that grammatical constructions encode an event in different ways, steering the way we think about a political protest. And different depiction of event, which is done by different grammatical constructions, index political orientation of media outlet as well. So building upon such previous research, I interrogated questions like these. The first and main one is, how does metaphor and grammatical constructions in parts and media index their ideological slant, and what are implications for this paradigm? Uh, these are main inquiries of this research. And in terms of methodology, I used cognitive linguistic CDA, which is a quite young strand of critical discourse analysis. This approach allows you to see how texts are perceived by readers and driven by various theories within cognitive linguistics paradigm, such as conceptual metaphor theory by Lakoff and Johnson, and cognitive grammar um, by Laniker. So the CDA also has an emphasis on the relationship between text and conceptualization, uh, looking at how discursive strategies are harnessed with various construal operations. Uh, but in this study, I look at specifically at metaphor and grammatical constructions in the press coverage of U.S. Capitol riot. As I mentioned, the purpose of the study is to see ideological slant of parts and media from linguistic point of view. So I collected data from 6 parts of media and 1 centralist media as a reference point, which is Yahoo News. So here I'd like to talk about metaphor and my findings. In short, they are 2 conventional metaphors used in the discourse of social movements, and I looked at war metaphor and fire metaphor. And in case of fire metaphor, it is only anchored with negative evaluation, but war metaphor, on the other hand, was used to positively appraise protest as well, in addition to negative appraisal. So, as you can see in the graph, 2 conventional metaphors are used widely uh, in different different media outlets. But fire metaphor um, was used only in Yahoo News, MSNBC, and Slate. Um, Despite fire metaphor, war metaphor was used by all media outlets. So that's one characteristics we can see in this quantitative analysis. So let's move on to war metaphor a little bit in depth. Um, so war metaphor, as I mentioned, is anchored with negative appraisal. As you can see, war metaphor can conceptualize protesters as invaders, by verbs like invaded, and sort of in the process of battle, deadly battle to defend. They were invading the capital, and police are ones who defend the capital, um, which may be familiar interpretation of event to you as well. So war metaphor can be used for positive appraisal, mainly presented by right-wing medias. For example, Breitbart says group of protesters also battled with large armed Capitol police outside the building. Epoch Times similarly report the event, saying fighting good fight, what I learned at a rally. Those examples report the protest in an analogy of war. So protesters and police are in a fight, and the difference between previous examples and these examples from right-wing media outlets are, first of all, protesters are depicted as a legitimate sign of the fight. As you can see, they are fighting a good fight, and also police are large and armed compared to this group of protesters. So this referential strategy is going on to um, sort of affirm their stance that protesters are legitimate entities and a protest. So to summarize, framing effect of bar metaphor is exploited regardless of ideological orientation of media outlets. Uh, Examples in the slides were just tip of the iceberg, but war metaphor can be utilized for both positive and negative appraisals. Um, Especially as such, in the left-wing press, war metaphor marginalizes the protesters and the protest, um, but right-wing media glorifies protesters and the protest using war metaphor. And also, I like to talk about fire metaphor, which is only um, associated with negative appraisal. So, for example, MSNBC reports the event. Trump struck a match and watched the fire spread. Of course, the protest and is an analogy with a fire. Also, Yahoo News report event, still the threat of violence ignited among the president's faithful may not be extinguished now that the siege of Capitol Hill is over. Also, an analogy with fire. And last one goes the same. Let the powder keg fuse. So, in those examples, important thing to note is that the start of fire is an analogy of the start of fire, sort of struck the match and ignited, and also fire spreads. So does the protest, and it has to be extinguished, as you can see in the second example. So, to summarize, fire metaphor is only used by liberal and centrist news outlets due to the nature of delegitimizing the protest, and also this primes the reasoning of um, quelling the protest. So the fire needs to be extinguished and put down. So the fire metaphor is an effective tool to delegitimize the protest. So I'd like to move on to image schema, which is harnessed with grammatical constructions. And I'd like to look at two specific events in the protest. One is protesters enter the Capitol building, and the other is a protester being shot by Capitol police officer. And there are clear tendencies in schematization between liberal, centralist, and conservative medias. And these two events are strongly associated with motion schema and action schema, respectively. So in the following slides, I will be reporting those two uh, events and how grammatical constructions are harnessed with ideological stance. So I would like to talk about motion schema, which is associated with protesters entering the Capitol building. So the right-wing media, the Epoch Times, report this specific event, saying that day a mob entered the Capitol building, vandalized federal property, and terrified government workers and officials. So in this grammatical construction, there's no impact of their entry is conceptualized. So as you can see in the model on the right side, there's no conceptualized impact grammatically here. But on the other hand, in Slate, a left-wing media, on the other hand, saying shortly after 1 p.m., the rioters pushed over the barricades and stormed the building and battered them into chambers. So in this example, impact is conceptualized. So the battered their way into, as you can see in the figure on the right side as well, the grammatical constructions actually depict how the impact was made by protesters when they entered the building. So such difference can be seen in patterns across different medias. The impact of motion is recognized in liberal and centralist media, which delegitimize the protest as a violent event. As you can see in the previous example, battered into, the impact is obvious. But on the other hand, right-wing media does not tend to conceptualize the impact of their entry, legitimizing the protest was non-violent event. So that's sort of the difference between two ends of political media spectrum from the view of motion schema. So moving on to action schema, which is about event. A protester got shot in the Capitol building by a police officer. A left-wing media Slate reports this incident, saying the invaders looted souvenirs. Police shot a woman dead. This grammatical construction is called default mode, which is transitive construction, and the event is depicted in neutral fashion, as you can see in the figure on the right side. Both police and a woman, two players in the incident, are conceptualized and modeled. So unlike previous example, a right-wing media, Breitbart, reports this incident differently, saying a woman was shot in the neck inside the Capitol building, according to videos and photos shared to social media Wednesday afternoon. The difference from the previous example is that this is intransitive. I'm sorry, this is stated as a transitive, but this is intransitive construction and non-default mode, not default mode, as you can see in the slide. So this event depicted in a less sensational fashion because the one participant in the event, police, is not focused in the sentence. There's no description of that the police was the agent who shot the bullet and killed the woman. So this is called agent-based mystification. Event does not capture the whole scene, but rather this woman got shot, but no police pulled the trigger. The Epoch Times, right-wing media, again, reports this incident, saying Asho Babbitt, 35, of Huntington, Maryland, died of a gunshot wound after being shot inside the Capitol building. This is also agent-based mystification, but this is the least sensationalism-centered way you portraying event, because as you can see in the figure on the right side, there's no police acknowledged grammatically, but rather the death protester is depicted as a autonomous event. There's no trace of gunshot when was made by a police officer who pulled the trigger. So this is further mystifying the existence of police. And the general characteristics of action schema, which is liberal media, have a tendency to portray the protest as a violent event, acknowledging two participants in event, which is harnessed with delegitimization of the event, because the protest is violent event was a violent event, and violent thing has happened in a way that a woman got shot by a police officer. But right-wing media has a tendency not to emphasize such violent aspect, not conceptualizing both participants in the incident. And as you can see in the graph, right-wing media tends to go for such strategy, although the left-wing medias go the otherwise. So finally, in conclusion, I hope to have been able to illustrate it, that the cognitive linguistic frameworks allows us to analyze ideological effective language and how it is used by partisan media for their convenience. Also, media's political and ideological orientations are reflected in particular linguistic conceptual sites, such as grammar and metaphors. Lastly, legitimization and the legitimization of political protest fall along the line of political orientations of media sources. So, right-wing media tend to legitimize the protest because protest goal was on their side, and the left-wing media do the otherwise in a similar manner. So that was my research, and thanks for listening. I'm happy to take any comments and questions via my email address here in the slide. Thanks very much.